Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and delighted to welcome you here today to this Hinrich Foundation webinar where we're releasing the 2020 Sustainable Trade Index. My name is Andy Staples and I'm the Director of Research and Outreach at the Hinrich Foundation, and I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by an excellent panel of speakers and guests to share the findings of our latest index, and then also to engage in a discussion about what this means for the region, what it means for policy as well. Just in terms of format, I'm going to be inviting the editor of the 2020 Sustainable Trade Index, Christopher Clague from the EIU, to be going through the key findings. I'll also then ask our own research fellow, Steve Olson, to join us and share some thoughts about the policy implications for of the findings of this latest index. We'll then be going into a panel discussion, and all the speakers' bios are available on our website, and I would urge you to go and have a look at that. You can also download the paper that's being released today. And of course, we're delighted to be taking your questions and comments. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So please do look to put any questions into the chat box and they'll come up for me to have a look at, and I'll be able to pose them to all of our speakers a little bit later in the day. We're running for 90 minutes and I've got quite a quick pace to go through. So to get us underway, what I'd like to do is call on Mia Mikic, who is the Director of Trade, Investment and Innovation Division at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Mia has been a great friend of this project since its inception in 2016, and we're delighted to be able to welcome Mia today to give us some opening comments. Mia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this lovely introduction, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to our participants in many countries around the region. Hinrich Foundation is a collaborating institution of the Asia-Pacific Research and Training Network on Trade, and I'm delighted to participate in this event, releasing findings of 2020 Sustainable Trade Index. Two of the interviewees in the preparation of the study are also ARTNet advisors. Yet we can't take any credit for the report and for the index. That solely belongs to Economist Intelligence Unit and to the research team of the Hinrich Foundation. But we are very pleased to be able to contribute to this initiative. As you may know, since Saturday, the past weekend, and yesterday also in this region, we were celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations with our eyes mostly fixed on the future, and most notably on delivering the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development for All. This cannot be done without sustainable trade. A sustainable trade is more simply taken as trade delivering economic results while internalizing social justice and environmental responsibility goals. It does not come naturally, because often in pursuit of economic results, these goals might go into the second place. Therefore, it is essential to have a metric, a measurement, to help show if we are participating in international trade in a sustainable manner and how to continue doing so. When the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown many of us off our normal trajectory, staying a sustainability course is possibly the only way we could benefit from this crisis in the long run. So it is crucial to understand that Sustainable Trade Index that we are presenting today, while it is based on scores and rankings, is not to be used as a competition chip. It is based on solid theoretical and empirical linkages between the three inseparable aspects of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. And it is honed through extensive consultation among experts and other key stakeholders. It does allow policymakers and others to identify policy gaps and opportunities, particularly concerning collaborative actions and knowledge sharing, since by definition, trade is transboundary in nature. So I hope that this 2020 Sustainable Trade Index will inform policymaking and contribute to designing trade policies as a true means of implementing sustainable development goals. I am looking forward to the rest of this session, Andrew, and the panelists, and the continued engagement of ARTNet in this initiative. Thank you very much.
Mia, thank you for those opening comments and for stressing the importance of this index in terms of generating data and understanding for us to get into a conversation with policymakers around the region. With that, I'm going to turn to Christopher Clague. Chris is the managing editor and global editorial lead for trade and globalization at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And Chris also has been engaged in this project since its inception back in 2016 and is the author of this year's report. Chris, thank you for joining us, and let me pass over to you.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I think I'm waiting for some slides to show up here, but while I'm waiting for that, I'll say that this is the third edition of the Sustainable Trade Index. The first one was launched in 2016. Work on the index began long before that, but we've released versions of the index in 2016, 2018, and now again in 2020. And each iteration of the index has been slightly different. We've updated some of the indicators. This year we've added some new indicators. We refined some of them so that there are more accurate measures of what we're trying to get at with the Sustainable Trade Index. So with that said, I just want to give a little bit of background. So you can go to the next slide, please. A little bit of background, what was the initial driving motivation for this? And that was to come up with a definition of what constitutes sustainable trade. Sustainability is often lumped in or synonymous with environmental sustainability. And that's not inaccurate, but it loses some other aspects of what we consider and what everyone should consider sustainable. So the initial definition, which you can see on this slide, is that sustainable trade is participating in the international trading system in a manner that supports long-term domestic and global goals. That's an important point. So it's not only supporting your own domestic policies, but cooperating and collaborating at a global level to ensure that trade is sustainable. And then the three pillars come next, which Mia has already laid out in her opening remarks. And those are economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And these are not inseparable, they are inseparable. One thing feeds into another. So it's important to consider them as a whole and separately. But before I get into the results of the index, I want to make a couple of points about where we are in terms of sustainability and the effects of the pandemic. I mean, leading up in the years leading up to the pandemic, 2017, 2018, 2019, sustainability was gaining a lot of traction. Now, in large part, that was due to the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has developed, but it was also the private sector, separately from those goals, deciding that sustainability was good in and of itself. The pandemic may have resulted in a brief, well, we hope brief pause in that, but it might not be that brief. And that's something that is concerning. The chart that you can see on the left, I'm sorry, go to the next slide. Thank you. The chart that you can see on the left is the global debt as a percentage of GDP. Now, the COVID pandemic has caused the second global economic crisis in the last 11 or 12 years. And the EIU's forecast for 2020 is for a spike in global debt as a percentage of GDP. And beyond that, it's hard to tell where that's going to turn out, but the IMF and other organizations see global debt expanding even further from current levels. And what does this do in terms of sustainability? It has the potential of handcuffing governments in terms of what they can accomplish in sustainability goals, whether those are the SDGs or the goals they set for themselves. Now, the more encouraging note, and the chart that you see on the right, is sustainable capital raising. And this only goes up to 2019, but there are indications, early indications for 2020 that this trend has largely continued, even if it's leveled off slightly. Investors, the private sector, continue to see sustainable investment, sustainable financing, and sustainability policies in general amongst the private sector is continuing to be important and continuing to be a viable source of returns on investment. So that's encouraging. The picture is mixed, but we do see some encouraging signs amidst the less encouraging ones. Now, to get to the index, just briefly, so the overall results for 2020, Japan and South Korea, among the 20 countries that are covered by the Sustainable Trade Index, Japan and South Korea tie for the top spot at #1. Now, these two countries share a lot of similarities. They're they're both mature economies. They don't attract a lot of foreign and direct investment. Their growth rates are low. They have poor demographics. But in terms of other aspects of sustainable trade, they're doing quite well, especially in the environmental and social pillars. The US and China are 6th and 7th, respectively, in the index, although they are separated by 10 points, and that's out of 100 possible points. The US potentially could have done even better in the index had it not been for the considerable rise in tariff measures over the last couple of years. Not to mention non-tariff measures, but specifically the tariff measures that the Trump administration has implemented, dragged down the US's score for the 2020 STI, Sustainable Trade Index. The last, but certainly not the least notable outcome from the 2020 index is that there's been some backsliding in Vietnam. Vietnam is currently, I think, the darling of Asia in terms of shifting supply chains and theories and speculation about where supply chains are going as a result of the trade conflict, trade war, whatever you'd like to call it, between China and the US, rising labor costs on the eastern seaboard in China. But Vietnam has slid backwards on some aspects of the STI. And I also think, and this is brought up in the white paper, which is available for download at the Hinrich website and also at eiuperspectives.com, the Vietnam supply chain story might be oversold a little bit, or the prevailing narrative might be exaggerated for, let's say, the benefit of people who like to see change for its own sake. China is 1/10 the size or less of China. So really the potential for Vietnam to fill the gaps, any gaps that might arise from companies moving out of China is really unrealistic. So I think that's something that needs to be investigated, and we talk a little bit about it in the white paper. Before I get into the results of the three separate pillars of the index, the economic, social, and environmental pillars, the paper does have two case studies in it. And the first one covers India. India, in addition to Vietnam, is supposedly one of the potential beneficiaries of supply chains moving out of China or diversifying. And a lot of the talk in this context of India taking more of the supply chain trade is about the quality and reach of infrastructure in India. What we do in this case study is talk about it in a more specific context, in the context of the three Indias. And this was a conceptual framework that was put forth by someone that we interviewed from a think tank in India. And his argument was that in the parts of India that are actually capable of integrating into global supply chains right now, and that's in terms of education and skills that are available, the infrastructure is not so bad, and that's 70 or 80 million people. It's not on the level of Singapore or Japan, but it's certainly up to the standard to allow that portion of the country to integrate in global supply chains. Now, what you're looking at in the second India is about 150 to 200 million people that have access to the skills that are required, but perhaps haven't capitalized on those opportunities quite yet. And then the third India is 700 to 800 million people, where the infrastructure is poor and but the skill levels are certainly not up to the level that would benefit from having roads and rail and ports. It doesn't really matter at this point, because if you build a road to a factory that can't be staffed by people that have the skills to work in it, it doesn't really matter. So while infrastructure is important and it does get a lot of attention in the context of India, education is equally, if not more important. And that, I think Steve, when he gets to the recommendations that come out of the paper, will talk about that. In the social pillar of the index, Taiwan comes out on top for the second time. So building on their successes of this year, Taiwan has been one of the most successful countries in combating the COVID pandemic. In terms of the social pillar, they do quite well on almost every indicator that makes up the category. The social pillar notably has the largest gap between the top scores and the bottom scores. So between Taiwan at number 1 and the country at number 20 at the bottom of the index, it's the largest gap. And that gap has been expanding since 2016, when we first launched the Sustainable Trade Index. Now, this comes back to how we measure inequality. Now, in the index, we do have a pure measure of inequality, which is the Gini coefficient, which a lot of international organizations and economists use to measure inequality. But it's probably time to think about inequality in a broader sense. So not only income inequality, but the inequality that comes from lack of access to education, political instability, lack of ability to congregate in terms of labor standards. And then finally, on the social pillar, we've included this year a new indicator on human trafficking. Human trafficking is a problem all over the world, particularly in Asia, and it's not a sustainable practice for building a labor force. And that should be quite obvious, and we probably should have added this earlier. But countries that rely on human trafficking for building their labor force, whether it's indentured labor or slave labor, that's not a sustainable policy in any way, and especially regards to trade. And finally, on the environmental pillar, Japan tops this pillar in the index. It is one of the three, one of the three countries in the index that has a carbon pricing scheme in place. So it benefits in terms of its score and ranking in that regard. There are not many bright spots in the environmental pillar of the index. I mean, at least compared to 2018. From the 2016 to 2018 index, we saw some progress. From 2018 to 2020, that progress was far less subdued. Now, the silver lining of the pandemic, the potential silver lining of the pandemic here, is that the reduction in economic activity has led to improvements in air quality, water quality, and other environmental measures around the region. Now, whether or not that remains a silver lining depends on policymakers and the private sector retaining those benefits and building on them and expanding them if and when the recovery occurs and economic activity resumes something close to normal. I think that was 15 minutes, so I'll end it up there and pass it over to Steve to cover the recommendations. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much for taking us through the structure of the index and also the key findings there across those three pillars as well. Delighted now to invite Steve Olson, who's a research fellow here at the Hinrich Foundation, to take us through some of the implications and recommendations that we have within the paper. Thank you, Steve.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Andy, and good afternoon, everyone. We're very pleased and grateful to see the amount of interest that you're expressing in the Sustainable Trade Index. Now that Chris has provided us with a clear overview of the construction and the results of the index, as Andy mentioned, what I'd like to do is explore some of the policy implications of the 2020 STI. Could I ask the organizers to put my PowerPoint up, please, and open it to the first page? Thanks very much. What I'd like to do is explore some of the policy implications and then at least attempt to place our discussion about trade sustainability into the broader context of these remarkable times that we're all currently living through. The coronavirus pandemic has provided a very stark and painful reminder of just how and why these principles and concepts of sustainable trade are so relevant and so critical. Sustainable trade is really about balance, a balance between economic efficiencies and our need to strengthen social capital and provide for environmental stewardship. And the pandemic has shined a very bright spotlight on the fact that many countries are not doing a good enough job in striking that balance. The pendulum, it appears, has swung a little bit too far in the direction of economic gains and economic efficiencies. And of course, the pandemic is now exacting a very high toll on all of us for this imbalance that we were allowed to continue. So for example, if we look at the economic pillar of the Sustainable Trade Index, we see that countries that pursue sustainable trade ensure that their trading relationships are diversified and resilient. But during the pandemic, we saw that many countries had allowed their trading relationships to become overly dependent on one or a small number of countries, and this left them in an extremely vulnerable situation. Now, to be clear, I'm not just talking about medical equipment, medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, things of that nature. Keep in mind that in the early days of the outbreak, before coronavirus had even spread beyond the borders of China, several automotive production facilities in Korea had to close down because they were entirely dependent on China for production of one relatively minor intermediary good. If we look at the social pillar under the Sustainable Trade Index, we see that countries that pursue sustainable trade place a very high priority on ensuring governmental and political stability. And we saw during the pandemic that those governments that were able to ensure high levels of public buy-in into their policies to contain the virus, by and large, did much better. Whereas those governments that were less highly functional, that had lower levels of public confidence, struggled with greater levels of difficulty and typically paid a higher cost, both in terms of the economic cost and the social cost. And then finally, under the environmental pillar of the index, we see that countries or economies that pursue sustainable trade take their responsibility towards environmental stewardship very, very seriously. And of course, now we're all getting an education in the linkage between deforestation and zoonotic diseases like we're currently experiencing now with the coronavirus. And scientists have already been very, very clear. If we continue at current levels of deforestation, it is a foregone conclusion that the coronavirus will not be the last zoonotic pandemic that all of us have to suffer through. So I'm not sure if we needed any reminders about how and why sustainable trade is critical, but the pandemic certainly provided that reminder. This all then raises a fairly obvious question, which is, okay, well then over the longer term, will the coronavirus pandemic ultimately help or hinder the achievement of sustainable trade? I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's still far too early to tell for certain. I do, however, at least on an initial basis, see some reasons for optimism and some reasons for pessimism. Unfortunately, we know that when countries experience economic distress for any reason, it raises the temptation to try to take shortcuts to growth and to investment by reducing labor and environmental standards. Now, this is a mistake that will always backfire over the longer term, but yet we recognize that this temptation is nonetheless there. And we've seen during the course of the pandemic, countries from India to the United States, unfortunately succumbing to this temptation. In India, several states, in a bid to spur investment, have significantly reduced some of their labor protections. And in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency has waived a number of environmental reviews, which typically need to accompany major infrastructure projects. More recently, and some of you are probably aware of this, in the first week of October, Indonesia passed a massive omnibus reform bill. Indonesia, it appears, unfortunately, is on the verge of tipping into recession, its first recession since the Asian financial crisis. And so the Indonesian government is attempting to spur additional foreign direct investment through this new omnibus reform bill. And to be fair, it certainly does some positive things. It usefully cuts back on some unnecessary red tape, for example. Unfortunately, it also cuts back on environmental and labor protections. So the Indonesian government, in essence, is wagering that it can benefit by reducing trade sustainability. Their implicit calculation is that lower labor and environmental standards will make Indonesia more attractive to foreign investors. Frankly speaking, though, I think that is an incorrect assumption. These old, outdated, cliched notions we have about businesses being eager to jump into a race to the bottom and take advantage of lower labor and environmental standards in different jurisdictions is thankfully rapidly falling out of sync with current day realities. Today, more and more businesses recognize that such an approach just doesn't make good business sense over the longer term, and frankly runs contrary to the values held by their customers, by their investors, and even their own employees. And so we're seeing business now more and more taking the lead in sustainability and even getting out ahead of some governments. And this is something we've actually seen specifically with the Indonesian reform bill I mentioned. As soon as the intentions of the Indonesian government became clear, a group of about 35 major investment funds with more than $4 trillion in assets under management sent an incredibly blunt letter to the Indonesian government. And they said, don't do this. This is a mistake. If you lower labor and environmental standards, you will not make Indonesia more attractive for investment. You will make Indonesia less attractive for investment. And I thought that was really profound. I thought that was a very important, profound point. And I think it gives us some reason for optimism and to feel encouraged. One other item I'll refer to just briefly that I think also gives us at least some reason for optimism. In the wake of the economic slowdown resulting from the pandemic, we've of course seen countries around the world put into place large stimulus packages, large stimulus programs. I've really been struck by how many of these stimulus programs include stipulations that funding, whether provided to government agencies or businesses, that they will be required to conduct their operations in ways that are considerably more sustainable. And it gives us, I think, reason to at least hope that this catchphrase that we keep hearing about build back better might be more than a catchphrase. It might be more than a bumper sticker, and it might actually be taking hold in governments, business, and broader civil society. As I said, let's hope so. So as I said, I think it's too early to tell over the longer term whether this pandemic will ultimately help or hinder the achievement of sustainable trade. But without a doubt, I think it has highlighted how and why all of these principles are critically important. I think I'll draw my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to our discussion.
Steve, thank you very much, and to Chris as well. And if I could ask you both to stay there for a while, because we'd like to come back, and I can already see some questions coming through from the audience as well. I'll just take this opportunity to remind everybody to please do send in your questions through the chat box, and I'll try to get through as many of them as I can. Thank you both for taking us through the index, thinking about some of the policy implications there, and we'll certainly come back to those themes that you picked up on. But what I'd like to do now is to turn into a more of a structured panel discussion. And to help us with that, I'm delighted to welcome our guests today. I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to all of them. We have Susan Stone, who's head of the Emerging Policy Issues Division, Trade and Agricultural Directorate at the OECD. We have Sara Elder, who's the senior economist, head of the Regional Economic and Social Analysis Unit for the ILO in APAC, and also Jayant Menon, who's visiting senior fellow at the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute here in Singapore, and previously lead economist at the Asia Development Bank as well. Everybody, thank you very much for taking some time to join us. And we're delighted to have a spread of such great organizations here because all of you I know are interested in sustainability in some form or the other. We wanted to invite you in to, I think, get your comments first and foremost on this latest index that we're releasing today in the context of the COVID pandemic. And also to be getting your thoughts from your particular vantage points at your respective organizations. As I mentioned earlier on, I'd like then to take some of the questions that we have from the audience. And again, I can see those coming through now. But to get us underway, I wonder if I could come to Susan. And Susan, the OECD is, over the last few months, been very focused on the pandemic and this issue of building back and resilience and so on. But perhaps I could invite you first and foremost to give your thoughts on what you've heard so far before taking us into some perspectives from OECD.
Sure, Andrew. Thanks very much. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me here today. I'm very excited about this project and about the index itself. I think it's a great initiative. And as Mia said, it really does help provide some context to a more holistic approach to talking about trade. I also want to pick up something that Stephen was talking about in terms of opportunities and in terms of being optimistic, because we really see this current crisis as an opportunity to do some stock taking, as well as looking at policies that have contributed to some of the, if you will, suboptimal outcomes that we've observed, and how we can build back better, and how we can become more resilient, especially in the context of trade. The OECD is tracking a number of policy areas in this regard, and I would like to highlight 3 of those areas going forward that have a particularly affected or are affected by trade. First one is green transport, in order to stay focused on facilitating trade in a more sustainable manner. We talk about green transport, and that goes to a lot of facilities, but also from our perspective in terms of trade facilitation. We saw during the pandemic there was a real call to action in terms of trying to keep goods and services going. In order to get those goods that we all became so dependent on, the transport systems that we became really dependent upon, to keep our lives going, in terms, especially in the last mile, getting the small parcels project to our homes so that we could keep working, we could keep shopping, we could keep our children engaged in educational activities while we were at home. So we saw some of these things in terms of simplifying documentation, streamlining border processes, but really important from what we're looking at the OECD is in transparency and cooperation, having a more and consistent transparency, especially in terms of movement of people across borders and how important that can be in terms of understanding what the protocols are, understanding what the processes are to keep us going. So we've been doing a lot in terms of looking at what that means in terms of trade facilitation. The second area I want to talk about is support of renewable energy. So of course we want to support this movement toward renewables. And there's two ways we talk about doing that: through supporting innovation. And innovation becomes super important. Trade can support that. We've done some recent empirical work in this area where we've documented how trade can help disseminate innovation and advanced technology in renewable energies. For example, in wind turbines. These are very complex pieces of machinery that take years to develop any kind of expertise in terms of manufacturing. But yet, when you open up markets and you allow trade, this technology can then be transferred to other markets where we have actually documented that it displaces old fossil fuel-based technology and old fossil fuel-based energy sources. So trade can actually act as a way to disseminate innovation and technological advances. Another area to support renewable energy is in recycling. We know renewables use a lot of things like batteries. They increase the demand for extractives, but we don't want to trade an answer to a global problem like climate change for a greater problem at a more local level in terms of extractive industries or trying to take apart something like a battery. So one answer could be to actually increase the trade in these goods, especially when we talk about e-waste. So there are certain conventions and regulations that are in place that regulate this for really good reasons, but it might be an opportunity to look at these, to take another look at some of these regulations. Advances in technology such as blockchain and tracing have allowed us to be able to really monitor these goods much more closely, because in order to really develop a true circular economy approach, we're going to need to have a sustainable and an active recycling industry, which is going to need to involve trade, because a lot of the recycling activities rely on economies of scale and rely on technology that's available in certain markets. And so those goods need to reach those markets so that we're not, like I said, trading one local environmental problem for the solution of a global environmental problem. And finally, I'd just like to talk about, at the OECD, we talk about the use of loans and grants and tax concessions to promote building back better, to promote more sustainable answers to a lot of the problems or issues that have been thrown up into stark light through the COVID crisis. But what we've been saying in the Trade Directorate is you really do need to actually look at what's in place already. There are a lot of subsidies that are currently in place that act as counterproductive to this goal. Fossil fuel subsidies are, of course, the poster child. Everybody talks about fossil fuel subsidies. There's some $478 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies in the economy. Another area is agricultural subsidies, which also can distort markets. The OECD estimates there's $700 billion worth of agricultural subsidies currently in markets that could maybe be repurposed or put to different uses. And finally, there's industrial subsidies, which is an area that we at the in Trade Directorate have been getting into more so lately through a report we did on aluminum and semiconductors. And a lot of these industrial subsidies encourage overcapacity and encourage use of non-sustainable methods to meet demand on the global market. And so we would we would also caution to, yes, it's important to look at new tax concessions and new grants areas, but it's also important to look at what's already in place and what can be repurposed or even eliminated in the goal of more sustainable trade. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for outlining some of those key issues there. I was taking note because I'd like to come back and explore in a bit more detail, particularly around trade facilitation and the issue of subsidies as well is something that's really come up to the top of the agenda, I think, in recent months. But thank you very much for that. I'd like now to turn to Jayant Menon. And Jayant, thank you for joining us from the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies here in Singapore. Let me just give the floor to you and to hear your first comments. And I'm sure there's some points that I'd like to come back and pick up a little bit later on. But over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And let me start by thanking the Hinrich Foundation for having me in this session today. I'm very pleased to be here and congratulate Hinrich for producing the third report on the Sustainable Index. I was lucky to be involved with the very first one when they were still working through the methodology and so on. And I'm delighted that it's survived and thrived, and how the measurements have now expanded to include new aspects of trade, of labor movements, of environment. And so it's fabulous that this has happened, and I wish and hope that this will continue into the future. Let me very quickly just say a few things. I enjoyed listening to all the presentations and the remarks from Susan just now. I think this index reminds us of what economists can contribute to the current debate ongoing about handling this pandemic. The index, of course, highlights the role of trade-offs between efficiency and equity, about economic gains versus social improvement and social conditions. So it's trade-offs and how those trade-offs are struck, I think, that economists can contribute to how we manage this crisis, this pandemic going forward. I think it's critical that we listen to the scientists, get as much information about how this virus evolves, transmits, etc. But then we should use that information, but when we need to use that information to formulate policies, we have to remember these trade-offs. And these trade-offs depend a lot on local conditions. There is no one-size-fits-all solution or response to this crisis. I think what works in rich countries may not work in the same way in poorer countries. And this is where those trade-offs come in. And balance, which is again fundamental to this index itself. The balance between health risks on one hand and economic survival on the other. So I think this, this debate, which has been vulgarized, I think, by President Trump, unfortunately, between lives and livelihoods, works in a very different way in developing countries or in countries with large proportions of people who are poor. In those countries, lives and livelihoods are not trade-offs, right? They're often one and the same thing. You cannot survive or continue to live without a livelihood. This is where I think the response in the form of lockdowns are doomed to fail in poor countries. Lockdowns in poor countries do not always come with the social safety net that we take for granted in richer countries. So you cannot force people to stay at home if you cannot also allow them to survive through social support from governments. So while some people can stay at a computer and earn a living, like a lot of us do, but many others who have to scavenge or have to beg for a living cannot be forced to stay at home unless you make it you make the conditions such that they can survive through government subsidies or support. These types of government support are often absent in the best of times and certainly not available for many in the worst of times, which is the current situation. So I think we need to tailor responses to local conditions, and in poor countries, those conditions mean that you cannot implement prolonged lockdowns for any discernible period of time. So I think this move from general to targeted measures is a welcome change in poor countries. And I'm delighted that the WHO itself now has come out and said that lockdowns only serve to make the poor poorer in developing countries. So this is coming from the preeminent scientific international organization on health issues. So I think in the context of this index today, that balance is one that we need to also consider, with the trade-off between health risks or containing health risks and how we go about it, and what that does to economic conditions and how it can threaten lives and livelihoods of the poor. So finally, let me say that I think 10 months after we first found out about this horrible virus, we no longer have the privilege of responding in a panic situation. We know a lot more about this virus, and we know a lot more about what works and doesn't work in how we respond to this virus. So going forward, I hope that that balance is struck with that knowledge in mind, and I would again push for a move away from general lockdowns to targeted measures, especially in the developing world. And I think the trade-offs work in favor of ensuring that the poor can survive, the measures designed to actually help deal with the virus. That trade-off is very different in poor countries compared to richer countries. So let me stop there, Andrew, and turn it back to you.
Jayant, thank you very much. And I really like the parallel that you're making there with the economic trade-offs, because that's right at the heart of this index, looking at the economic, the social, and the environmental trade-offs. And of course, the whole point of the index is to promote balanced outcomes, and therefore, yes, we want to see economic growth and development, but not at the expense of society or the environment. And therefore, once we have some solid data that we can analyze and share, where are the learning points that can be shared across the region and across governments as well? It's very much our intention with this. So thank you very much for those comments. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in as well about the index, about trade dependencies, about human rights. And so a nice segue, if I could come over to Sara then, from the ILO. We were just hearing there from Jen about the unequal impacts that the pandemic has had on different parts of the populations and different countries as well. Labour issues are right at the heart of this index, as well as Chris was referencing earlier on. So I wonder if I could just come to you for your few comments on the index, and from your vantage point at the ILO.
Yes, thank you so much. And let me start by thanking you first for having the ILO as part of the discussion, and for giving me an opportunity to react to this index, which I think is really an excellent tool for showcasing how we can and how we should foster social and environmental, how trade can foster social and environmental gains, how the two can fit together, how we can balance these trade-offs, as Jayant mentioned. Now, of course, we talk about can and should. The language I use here is very conditional, can and should. We know that it's important to balance economic and social issues, but how we do it is a bit more difficult to get to. But I do think the index is important because the more we bring the connections to light and the more we can help with policymakers to better understand the positive long-term gains of sustainable trade. So again, thank you for having me. I'd also like to thank you for including labor issues within the index and for expanding to very important topics like trafficking and helping us bring to light these horrible abuses. So let me give a few reactions, but I should say that there's a great deal of overlap in our interests. I work for the International Labor Organization, which is a UN agency that looks at issues of social justice and the promotion of decent work for all. Our mandate is to discuss issues in a tripartite manner, meaning we bring together the governments, the workers, and employers to discuss very, I'd say, topical and tricky issues, and to come together with negotiated conventions, negotiated standards. And one of the trickier issues that we've always been dealing with is trade. Now, I came to the organization in the early 2000s, and that's right around the time when the discussion on globalization was really taking off. In fact, in 2004, the ILO hosted a global commission on the social dimensions of fair globalization, which I won't go into any details on, but I just wanted to mention that there is a very strong precedence in looking at how to balance issues of economic growth with social issues. So let's talk a bit about how the crisis is bringing to light a lot of the deficiencies in labor markets and a lot of the weaknesses in the growth trajectories that are very dependent on trade, as has already been mentioned by Stephen in his introduction. So certainly it's the countries that have been most harshly hit in the crisis are those that were aligned to the global value chains. And the ILO estimated that there were approximately 300 million jobs in the manufacturing sectors that were most harshly, that have the impact of collapsing due to their connection to the consumer demand. So 300 million jobs have been at risk due to this COVID collapse. Now, have we lost all of these jobs? Have they disappeared? Certainly not. We have, rather than seeing a disappearing of jobs, we've seen a very severe loss of working hours. Now, we estimate approximately a 16% loss of working hours across the globe from the last quarter of 2019. And this is a scale that we haven't seen since, I'd say since the Second World War. But again, we ask, does a loss of working hours then translate into a loss of jobs? And again, no, not in all cases. And why is that? A lot of it has to do with the labor market institutions of a country and the labor protection systems of a country. So where you do see very severe job loss is indeed in the countries which have weaker labor protections. In the United States, for example, where unemployment has really skyrocketed. Now, you have not seen such a large increase in unemployment in a country like in Japan and Korea, for example. And why? It's because they have labor institutions that protect workers from being let go so easily. Another reason that we haven't seen so much job loss in certain countries has to do with how governments the type of policies governments are implementing in their COVID response. So in a country like, again, I stick with Korea and Japan, which have come out so well in the index, These are countries that have invested a lot in supporting enterprises to retain their workers through the crisis. So they've used the instrument of wage subsidies to support enterprises to keep people on the payroll, rather than simply letting everyone go and allowing the unemployment system to deal with them. Now, this has proven to be very beneficial to allowing some workers to maintain income. And then you have the social protection system, which can come in on the other side to help boost the incomes that they've lost due to the loss of working hours. It's a choice that some countries have made in how they orient their COVID response system. You have other countries that do things differently. And here I can take the example of China, which has taken a more of I'd say a pro-business approach. They've decided to keep production going as much as possible during the COVID loss of demand coming from the external trade system. So they've decided to invest in continuing in infrastructure development, for example, and to keep production going. Again, as I say, it's a choice that governments make. Do they want to keep businesses going, or do they want to support workers and support incomes? And I think there are trade-offs, and it's very interesting to hear from Stephen. Stephen mentioned the trade-offs that some governments are making and the dangers of governments choosing to support an easing of business restrictions at the cost of weakening labor protections, such as we've seen in Indonesia, and certainly we're keeping a very close eye on Indonesia. Now, these are long-standing debates. COVID is simply bringing to light a lot of the weaknesses that we see in government's choices and how they orient their growth strategies. But I do think there's, as Stephen mentioned, some opportunities to be investigated in how we go forward. And what COVID has done has shifted priorities to important topics like social protection, the importance of universal social protection. It shifted the prioritization of helping enterprises to become more formal, helping workers to formalize. And it's certainly changed how, or it's causing a change in the dialogue amongst governments on how they're going to orient their growth strategies in the future.
Sarah, thank you very much for those comments and bringing the attention onto labour markets, of course, a key component of the index. And really interesting to think about what learning there is for governments, particularly in developing economies within the region, from the index. And as we look at the responses to COVID about labour protection and so on, of course, we do see a positive economic story in some countries, South Korea recently with good economic data suggesting a stronger rebound there, and in China as well. And I guess a question that I'd pose to all of you, as we supposedly see something of a sharper V-shaped recovery within the region, do these issues start to fall off the side of the table as governments focus once again on pursuing growth? And maybe, Sarah, if I could keep with you, just for your quick thoughts on that one.
Oh, I'll certainly, Andrew, I hope that that's not the case, but there is a tendency to forget about the social issues when the economy is moving along in a good sense, and it's a problem that we face in a lot of the middle income countries, which in a sense have been trapped in the middle income status for decades now. And one of the reasons, I think, has to do with the fact that they prioritize economic growth over social growth. And what happens there is you end up with a very polarized system of a surplus, low wage, low skilled labor force, and the high skilled, which will be snapped up and will do quite well, until they reshift how they invest in in the institutions of work rather than the institutions of finance and trade, I think we will unfortunately potentially see a continuation of the same old story. But here we are to help remind them of doing things differently and to taking a more human-centered approach moving forward.
So as we move into this more general discussion period, I'd like to invite Mia to come back in as well. And on that same issue, I guess with in the backdrop of the COVID pandemic, how does an organization like UNESCAP work with governments in developing economies to say, this is the wake-up call, this is the learning that we have from things like the Sustainable Trade Index, or we could be looking at other countries and how they've approached, for example, labor, as we were just hearing from Sarah. And how do you help them with that roadmap to a more sustainable approach to trade?
Thank you, Andrew, for that question. And I think I will start by saying that our regional commission main mandate is to actually promote regional cooperation. And what we have seen through this pandemic is really the danger of the lack of trust and collaborative concerted actions to actually take into the place. And yes, in many cases, the index, for example, the result of it will depend on unilateral reforms and policies, etc. But in many cases here now that we face is really that regional cooperation is of utmost importance. And so what we have started, and we have had this program of regional cooperation in both trade facilitation and in trade area. We basically, to help countries smoothen the process of goods crossing the borders, we are encouraging them to adopt contactless, paperless trade procedures. And in order to help them do that, it's not only that they can, join the treaty that we have on paperless trade, but we have the accelerator program for them to build capacity of different government the agencies, customs agencies, etc., to be able to actually proceed faster with the process of digital trade facilitation in simple way. Also, what we have taken on board is the fact that, as it was demonstrated also in the report, that when the pandemic started, many countries have also started to implement the export constraining policies, export bans, and in particular in certain segments or sectors of medical and essential goods. And so we looked into the possibilities to come with better provisions for trade policies, in particular for the regional trade agreements. So we have a global initiative now in process ongoing to come up with a better way of designing regional trade agreements and certain other trade agreements that would be in place for the governments to rely on once the crisis happens again, which will certainly happen. So this is what we do at the regional level, and in short, regional cooperation is one of the stuff that one of the directions that we are promoting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to dive straight into to some of the questions now that I've got everybody here together, and a couple focused on the index itself. So I'm going to direct this to Chris and to Steve, although Jayant, as somebody who was there right at the beginning as well, please do feel free to jump in. So a question here, is the policy goal to balance across the pillars, i.e. to manage the trade-offs that you were talking about earlier, Jayant, or instead to strengthen mutually beneficial independence across the pillars? So let me throw that one out to the people most closely involved. So Chris, Steve, Jayant, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think I already mentioned in my remarks, and I think it's been mentioned a couple of other times by some of the other speakers, is they're not mutually independent. These are all related. They're inextricable in a number of respects. So while we had to, for the organizing principle of the index, we had to construct it along these three pillars. They are all related. So I have a hard time thinking about how we would separate them out. I guess is the short answer to that question.
Thank you. And Jayant, maybe if you had a comment on that one too.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think the expert has spoken, but I guess what I would just say is that a lot depends on how these sort of measures are used in terms of changing policy. So at one level, we measure outcomes, and then a rise in the index, a certain index might be seen as good. But the optimal values for these sorts of indices depend on, preferences of governments, right? And to give you an example, I mean, this whole pandemic, I think, has highlighted social value systems, right? One social value system, if you take a Rawlsian approach, where you want to try and, focus on the worst off in society, then, a lot of countries have failed in doing that, in responding to this pandemic. I think this pandemic has produced such a dramatic response in policy because everyone was at risk, or anyone was at risk. Even presidents caught this virus. But then, people are dying every day now from highly preventable diseases that have cures. More people die from TB and waterborne diseases in India than they have from this virus. And this virus is spreading like wildfire in India. So, it's about choices and it's about value systems. I think these indexes are useful in terms of presenting one set of trade-offs based on a value system. It's how you use them in changing policy, and that depends on value systems of governments.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to take another question. And Susan, if I could come back to you. You were mentioning earlier on about the focus on renewable energy, and again, sort of echoing Jayant's note there on trade-offs. The environmental and health impact of energy, particularly dirty energy like coal-fired power stations across the region, has been huge. As you put your finger in the air, do you get a sense of a growing acceptance from more countries within the region that this is an opportunity to double down on renewable energy at the moment? Chris was referencing earlier on the big increase that we've seen from the financial sector in terms of funding for renewables, among other things as well. But do you sense that things are changing now, given this focus on Build Back Better?
Yeah, I mean, in the region in particularly, and even among OECD countries, we do see an increased focus on renewables, on an opportunity, as I said, to displace. It's tied up. It's interesting. People talk about the kind of interdependency among the three pillars: the social and the environmental and the economic. And I think this is a good example of where we can see that, where there's an opportunity to invest in infrastructure. There's an opportunity for that investment in infrastructure to be in a renewable way. So there's a switch to solar, to wind power, to these other types of renewable energies, and also there's a desire to bring the workforce up to speed in order to support those investments. So one of the things that we've shown is that with the import of this kind of false choice between developing such a technology domestically versus importing it for jobs, we find that for like wind technology, for example, wind turbine, only about 17% of the jobs actually go to manufacturing. Really, the bulk of the jobs are in the maintenance and in the surveying of the plant once these turbines once they're in place. So you have this move now and this opportunity to not only promote renewable energies, but to do it in an infrastructure investment way as well as a labor market development way. And we do see this big support, I think, among governments going forward.
Well, let's hope we see some evidence of that next time we run the index and some improvements on some of those measures. I got quite a specific question. We were talking earlier on about supply chains, foreign direct investment, and so on. And let me take you through this question. From the perspective of advancing sustainable trade, what specific principles should policymakers follow when reconsidering policies towards cross-border supply chains? And maybe, Steve, if I could come to you on this one. But please, anybody else, feel free to jump in.
I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer to that, Andy. And I think, in fact, a lot of the responsibility falls on the shoulders of the private businesses. In other words, to avoid over-reliance on a limited number of trade partners. Governments have some role to play in that. I think also another important way, and this is a role for government, that we can build a bit more resiliency into supply chains, is to hasten this move towards digitization. If I could, though, Andy, I just wanted to sneak in a couple of quick comments on the previous questions. Yep. I think it's real interesting in terms of looking at the possibility of the pandemic spurring on renewables. Look at some of the specific programs in particular that some countries in Europe are undertaking in terms of their stimulus measures. A big part of Germany's stimulus program is electronic vehicles and electronic buses. The UK is spending a lot of money on retrofitting office buildings to make them more energy efficient. So, and the EU-wide stimulus program, which I think is somewhere on the order of $900 billion, about 30% of the investments they're going to be making through that fund are basically climate-friendly investments. So I think that's very interesting and telling, and hopefully encouraging thing for us to look at.
And just to echo that, Japan's recent announcement of the intention to go carbon neutral by 2050, joining China and others there as well. Thank you very much. I want to look at the issue of trade dependencies. Steve, you just mentioned it there about over dependency on supply chains and so on. But let me just pose this question. The first pillar, economic pillar, states to avoid over dependency in trade. One of the intentions is to avoid over dependency in trade. So how do we have a conversation with some of those least developed countries that are perhaps overly dependent on agricultural exports, or indeed some of the lower value-added manufacturing goods that there's global demand? So what are the particular sort of policy advice do we give to countries in that bracket? But perhaps if I could come to Mia for that one.
Sorry, I have problem unmuting myself. Well, I mean, look, Andrew, how do you define over-dependency on trade, right? In general, I think you need to be more specific. And so you actually gave away in that in saying agriculture. I can go with tourism, and I can go with other different sectors, raw materials, oil, etc. Right? So, I mean, how do you defend from that? You diversify. And if you're a small economy, you will have a problem in diversifying, right? And therefore, you need to be part of a bigger market, right? And you can diversify only if you're part of a bigger market, if you do not depend only on your small economy. And I think this is the answer in many of these sectors, right? I think what we have heard here about renewables, about digital, about upskilling the labor force, etc., all of these are elements of the economy to be able to diversify and to actually be less dependent on one single sector or one single partner in the international trade. If this is possible to achieve, and I think we have examples of that in the region, then I don't think we can or we should be talking about on too much dependency on trade. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I got a lot of questions coming through. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
And real quick follow-on point. I would certainly agree with everything my friend Mia just said, but I would add one additional comment. I do think it's necessary, though, particularly for some of these less developed countries, that we do give them a certain amount of policy space to recognize that if you're entirely or largely dependent on agricultural exports today, that's not going to change overnight, and that it's a bit of a process. And so we help them to understand that this is not sustainable and it's not in their long-term economic interests to remain overly trade dependent on agricultural exports. But by the same token, we understand that those changes can't happen overnight, and we provide a certain amount of policy space.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We've got about just over 12 minutes left, and I wanted to focus the attention looking forward a little bit more. And I'd like to pose this question to the panel. What can you anticipate the key trends of countries' performance for the next report in 2022, when COVID impact is much more visibly seen or evaluated? Let me put it another way. What would you want to see in terms of progress around promoting sustainable trade in the index if we were to run it in 2020? And I guess there what I'm asking you for is, what's the sort of key policy focus that governments should have in the region? Sara, if I could come to you first.
Tough question, Andrew. But, well, unfortunately, I think the economic pillar will go down in almost all of the countries over the next year. It will be extremely interesting to look at the index in the post-COVID, assuming we are post-COVID in 2021, 2022. So I do think there will be a strong attempt to become less trade dependent, or at least to shift the dependency away from global supply chains into potentially more regional supply chains. And we're already seeing some action in this area. We heard about Japan moving investment out of China and more into Southeast Asia. But my question related to that is, will that boost the labor? Will it make the lives of workers in Southeast Asia better? And it will only make it better if you have an interest on the part of Japan and Japanese investors in building the policy space within the developing countries to get more serious about labor protection, to help them build their capacity for social dialogue, build their capacity on social protection, for example. And I do think there is a great need for building capacity in these areas. And it's one of the reasons why they remain in this middle income track. They simply haven't been able to invest in building the strong labor market institutions that are needed to then break through to high income status. So I think there will be a lot of soul searching. And I hope that investment will push some good progress on the social areas.
Thank you. And keeping with that sort of social systems, Jen, if I could come back to you, and Sara there was talking about the sort of labor-related issues, but there's also the underlying issue of inequality within societies as well. So what would you be advising, hoping to see from governments from now on with regards to sort of building up that social systems?
Right. Okay. So before I answer that, Henry, if I may, I just jotted down some points on your earlier question on how the index perform.
Please, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think what we will see is that, obviously trade will fall sharply. We'll see inequality rising. We'll see the environment improving. But what's driving all of this? And depending on that, how sustainable will it be? I think, that's the big question. We might see improvements in the index more as a, reaction to this pandemic, but whether this results in learned behavior that lasts beyond the crisis is the key question. And unfortunately, the historical record's not very good in terms of how well we learn from crises. The previous crisis, economic crisis, the global financial crisis, taught us a lot about the risks within the financial system. And we brought in a lot of reforms, the Dodd-Frank Act and so on, a lot of which has already been reversed by the current administration because of their different discount rate, if you like, the time value, time preference of promoting current growth at the expense of future outcomes. And this is, I think, the problem. I mean, again, we come back to value systems and also the discount rate that people use about what we value presently versus the future. But on inequality, I think, as others have mentioned, this pandemic has shone a spotlight on existing inequalities, but it's also going to exacerbate them in significant ways, both within countries and between countries. Within countries, we know that the poor suffer more directly from the virus because they have weakened immune systems through malnutrition and the like. But also, as I mentioned, the social distancing measures or the response to the virus from governments has unfairly burdened the poor compared to the rest. They've had to bear a bigger burden of the general measures that have been introduced to protect health outcomes. So within countries, we'll see a worsening. And then between countries, I think we'll see a worsening because even the silver linings that we have spoken of, the push towards digitization, will benefit countries better prepared and better able to take advantage of these opportunities. So, Singapore, where I live now, is doing a lot to take advantage of this opportunity and press ahead with reskilling the workforce and digitizing the economy. They can, and they're doing it. Cambodia and Laos will not be in a position to do the same. And so the gaps between these countries will grow. And what we can do about that is a more difficult issue. But the unfortunate outcome is that even the silver linings have a price, and that will, result in greater inequality between countries.
Thank you. I think I've just got time very briefly to come to Susan, just for her comment before we move to wrap up this conversation. There are a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to. But I think one way in which we can deal with that is by taking some of the themes that have been raised in this conversation and in the questions, and be thinking about how we can be reflecting on them and dropping articles onto our website in the coming weeks, which is hinrichfoundation.com. And a quick plug, please do go and have a look at the website. You can download the white paper and the workbook from the Hinrich Foundation site. And there's a lot of excellent content there on issues related to everything that we've been talking about this afternoon. Susan, if I could come to you for your final comment.
Sure. I want to just say I agree with definitely with Sara that the continued trend away from global value chains that's been going on for the last 10, 15 years, depending on how you measure it, will probably continue. I'm not quite, in terms of it's funny, in terms of Jay's prediction about the benefit or the increasing environmental outcomes, the improvement, let's say, I'm not so sure. I do the report points out the fact that the crisis has led to the degradation of other types of environmental outcomes, such as illegal logging or water treatment. It depends if people are having to choose between having a livelihood and guarding environmental outcomes. They tend to want to feed their families, which is completely understandable. So I'm not quite as optimistic about the environmental outcomes. And of course, we talked about the inequalities that Jay, I can't agree more. And we haven't even talked about the differences in terms of gender. The fact that women are much being affected by the virus to a greater extent as well across all different kinds of measures. So there's those types of inequalities that will probably continue. On a positive note, because I don't want to sound like I'm Debbie Downer here, is that I do think this whole idea of recycling, of using trade to have better environmental outcomes in terms of recycling. We are going to have there will be this increase in digitalization, so there will be this increase in e-waste. There will be the single use that the COVID has greatly increased the single use of many medical equipment and other types of equipment. All of this will need to be dealt with in a recyclable, in a circular economy type way. And I think there's a business opportunity here, which I don't think will go unexploited. And I do think it'll be supported by a lot of government policy. So my bright point is I'm hoping that the circular economy will come to the fore, and the whole recycling industry will really pick up and be able to deal with some of these issues that we're going to be facing in the future.
Susan, thank you very much. Just before I come to Mia for some closing comments, I'd like to very quickly come to Chris. This year, the index had a couple of new indicators in there. Thinking about the pandemic and the responses that we've seen, if we were to revise the index and to put something new in to look at for the next index, what would you suggest that would be?
I mean, there are some indicators already in there in terms of preparedness for digital trade, which I think almost all of the panelists have pointed out is increasingly important. We do have technological infrastructure, education, which is related, but it is a thorny issue in terms of data. But I think the next go around, I'd like to get something in there that is more specific to digital trade. If I could just make one remark to go back to one of the questions that was raised earlier about the next version of the index and what I would expect to see or what might happen. I think the one thing that hasn't been mentioned so far is the dragon in the room, so to speak, which is China. The U.S. in the post-war period had influence over the global trading system, not because it had the strongest military, because it had the largest consumer market, and it could extract concessions from other countries because of that. China, if it doesn't already, will soon have the largest consumer market and is a significant source of outbound FDI. So what does that mean for sustainable trade? You could argue that the U.S. had principles it struggled mightily to uphold or adhere to, and especially over the last couple of years. I struggle, and I don't have to be as diplomatic as some of the other people on this call. I struggle to see what those principles are for China. So the more that it can influence trade behavior and outward FDI, or influence behavior in terms of outward FDI, I would expect over the next couple of years to see more backsliding if it becomes more influential in the region.
Okay, well, something for us to keep our eye on. And just as we get to time, Mia, I'd like to come to you for your final comments. And let me pass over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I may, Andrew, and I will be very brief, just to add to Chris' list of what to do for the next installment of index. I think we should do much better in terms of picking up the gender issues and enhance this one dimension that is there in the index, which, for example, how many women and how women can influence influence the policies and what is in there. And I think another aspect that came through from many comments, in particular Sara's, is that we are not picking up what is happening with the investment really, and so that particular one should be also taken into account somehow, particularly on this outward investment flows. Maybe do as you do at home, and how many companies follow that, etc. I think what is very important is that to understand that, in particular with respect to the value chains, it is the business sector that holds the wheel there, and yes, governments can try to influence, but in the end it will be based on the incentives that they can provide and the business decisions. And so we have to understand that in order to provide enabling environment, I think the governments should really try to be having a holistic and a long-term view rather than a short perspective, right? And that would provide, I think, a much better solution for that. So I think very important thing of the whole initiative is the opportunity for getting a tool for policy analysis, the results of the previous policy decisions, and how to use these in moving forward. And so I think the initiative is worthwhile and enhances capacity of policymakers in the region to actually provide better evidence-based policy design in future. So we are hoping to be able to expand on this and to collaborate in future as well. And we thank everyone involved for contributing to this very important initiative. Thank you, Andrew.
Mia, thank you very much, and thank you to yourself and everybody else on this call who has contributed to the rollout of the 2020 Sustainable Trade Index. I very much appreciate your time. Sorry to all of those people that I didn't get to in terms of your questions, but as I say, please do keep looking out on our website for responses to those. I think we'll try to find some way to respond to you. And finally, please do use the index. It's there to be used. It's there to inform discussions. There's plenty of great analysis in there. There's the workbook that you go in and play around with as well. We certainly use it in an educational setting with students around the region and beyond, and very much encourage you to do the same. So with that, I realise we're a little bit over time. Thank you for your patience, and please join me in thanking all of our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us, and cheerio.